Hi, I'm Sami, and this is the Career Kickstart Show. Today's guest is Derek Murphy. And now I got to tell you guys, Derek Murphy is the reason that I was able to live in a castle for a month. So, for that reason, even if it wasn't for all the other cool stuff that he's helped me with in my writing career, I would be eternally grateful to Derek because it was a French castle. So I got to tell people, oh, I spent the summer in the south of France, which that's always fun. So I digress. Derek Murphy is super awesome. He is a fiction author. He writes young adult speculative fiction. He is a publishing entrepreneur and a globetrotter who lives in Taiwan with his super awesome wife, Lana, who I think I'm a big fan. But Derek is doing so much and has such an interesting background. So, Derek, how about, I know that I gave a bite-sized bit about you. How about you throw on the what I left out? Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. So I was always more of a creative artist. I wasn't really very good at business. I just wanted to do my shit and do what I love and not really worry about the money at all, which led to decades of being a starving artist. I was a professional painter for a while. And then I started editing books when I was doing my master's, my PhD in literature, just as a way to survive because I hated teaching English, which was my part-time job. And so I was working with authors who needed a lot of help. I got pretty good at editing books. And then I moved into book cover design and book marketing and all the different things. But I found I don't really enjoy working on other people's products. So I started, plus I was always doing the same things over and over. I was always teaching new authors the same things. They always want to do things a certain way and they haven't gone through the years of learning it takes to learn what not to do. And I don't like repeating myself. So I started putting out all of these tutorials or to resources or templates or things that they could just use without me having to have a conversation with them and teach them the right way to do it. So that's what I do now. I still have clients, but I really am trying to distance myself from client work. I'd much rather people just go through my free or paid resources, courses, templates, whatever. There's so much content out there where you can learn how to publish and market your books better without making the mistakes. These days, I'm much happier just working on my own projects, writing novels, nonfiction books, and I make a lot of YouTube videos too, which has been going okay. I'm probably unique in that rather than doing one really tight funnel really well and just building it up with ads, I've just put out a shit ton of content. So I've got a decent sized platform because I have a lot of content. Now I'm working on fixing the conversion, improving the quality, stuff like that.
Okay, and for those who are listening, you've probably already gotten the impression that my man Derek here is a Renaissance man. And he's also a digital nomad, so he's going all over the places. He studied in Malta and in Florence and in Taiwan. And so you got a lot of perspective that you're bringing to your materials. And you have a lot of books out. How many fiction and nonfiction do you have out?
Probably about a dozen, and the fiction it's reviewed, but you can't really make good money with fiction until you have a completed series and box sets and maybe audiobooks, just because you're competing with ad spend against people who have a huge backlist. So when you're starting off, it gets pretty hard. So I'm confident that my fiction will make money when I finish it, but I'm also a relatively slow writer. I'm a much stronger outliner and editor than I am like a first drafter. Slows me down a lot. So I also started trying to work with co-writers in the last couple of years. So I put out like another dozen novels with them. So probably 30 books altogether. But the nonfiction books are really useful. They're helpful, but they're not general nonfiction books. So they're a very select special audience. They work really well to bring new clients or new fans to my platform, but they're not moneymakers. So I'm excited to finish some series and some general nonfiction books so that I can just run advertisements and just make money with my books instead of all the piecemeal other things that kind of bring in different various models of passive income.
Okay, for one thing that I think a lot of people have a misconception about publishing, whether that is traditional or self-publishing, is that they think you write the book and then I guess you mail it out and then somehow it ends up in Barnes and Noble. A lot of people don't realize that for both whether you're an author published by Random House or you are just publishing from your house, that you have to wear a lot of hats. You have to be the marketer. You have to be the person who writes the emails to your fans. You have to do your social media. There's a lot more to it. Do you feel like with people who want to take their writing to a professional level, what do you think is the number one mistake that they make if they want to start writing, they want to start publishing?
The number one mistake is not writing a book that people want to read. So all of the other stuff, all the marketing and promotion, like people don't want to do the work because they feel like they're a writer, they're a good writer, they're not a marketer, so they don't want to build an email list. A lot of them don't even want to talk directly to fans. They don't want to deal with advertising or websites or like all the other things, but they can't find anybody to partner with them. They can't find an agent or a publisher because nobody else is going to invest time or resources on your book unless they think it's going to make them money. So if you don't know who your audience is or why people should buy your book, then nobody else is going to know either. You've got to find the value. You have to develop who is this book for? Why are they going to read it? What are they going to get out of it? So that's just, to some extent, it's sales copy, and you can always get better at that. But to another extent, it's just having a general idea of the genre of your book. What other books is it like? Who is your audience? A lot of authors, they write a book and they have no idea about any of that stuff. They think a marketer or a publisher is going to help them to figure out what's the value of the book, and nobody else will do that for you. A lot of other people, like, you can pay a marketer or even like a small press, you can pay them a lot of money for book marketing services, but most of that stuff is PR or outreach, and they're not actually helping you with the core offer, which is conversion. So not even talking about the cover and the blurb and the reviews, which are the critical three, but just, is your book good? Does it satisfy readers? Do readers quit after the third page? A lot of authors believe they are better quality literary purists because they don't consider the market, because that's what they've been told by the romantic ideology of creative production, by Wordsworth and Blake and all of them. There's a lot of inspiring romantic quotes that we throw around about doing the creative work, which are they're misleading because they make it seem like if you do the work in isolation, it will be more satisfying to readers. And that's almost never true. So a lot of first-time authors, they have a book that they believe is destined for greatness because they've never gotten any kind of feedback and they've never researched the market and they don't know who's going to buy it. So now they're just looking for somebody else to take over for them, but they can't talk about why it's any good. Or you ask them what their book is about and they'll ramble for 10 minutes and not give you an answer because they don't know how to describe the value or the benefits. They're like, you just have to read it. I see a lot of people like, they make a mistake of, they're reaching out to strangers asking for reviews, or they're like, to get buy-in for their book, they're expecting other people to read the book before blurbing it or before making a cover for it or before doing any marketing for it. Asking someone to read your book is a big ask. You shouldn't even be asking your friends or family to read it and provide feedback, not only because they're not the right audience and they don't know any better, but also because you don't want to be asking for that kind of a favor from important relationships. You don't want to be asking for them to spend 10 or 20 hours of their time reading your book. Hopefully they'll enjoy it, but more likely it's not that great and they are going to feel uncomfortable. So anyway, so I think that's the biggest thing a lot of authors don't consider, is they think about the marketing of the publishing and actually they don't have a good book. So partly that's because there aren't a lot of good resources about how to actually write a good book, which is what I've really been trying to focus on the last couple of years. I've read a bunch of books which are more about how to be a literary writer. They talk about the importance of the words. And a lot of authors, they overanalyze they change the little words thinking it's going to matter, and it really doesn't. It's really just story structure and basic stuff like intrigue and suspense and conflict is a big one in fiction that a lot of first books, they just don't have enough.
Yeah, and one thing that you're talking about is making sure that you have the bones right before you start putting a hat on it. A lot of people, they do have that rush of being like, I wrote this thing, and I bet there's a lot of folks who are in quarantine who are gonna, work on that novel. but it's something where you do want to have a community. And that's something that you have built with Creative Indie, which for those who are listening, it's the word creative and indie together. I mean, you guys can Google it. You've built a community there and also with your guerrilla publishing group. What would you say is like the best thing for a writer to do if they're trying to look for community, whether it's for feedback or just solidarity? How do they go about it?
I think there's two kinds of writers groups. You have to be really careful. There's the ones who consider themselves the artist, and they're really critical about everybody else. They think they're trying to write the perfect book. They're really critical about writing to market or publishing, like advertising or marketing or cover design stuff. They feel like the book is enough. Like, just write a good book. Don't worry about all the other stuff. Or they say things like, I don't care about the money. I'm not writing for the money, which just means if you can't make your book convert well for less money than you spend on advertising, your book's going to be dead in the water. So if you spend years writing a perfect book and nobody ever reads it, my main thing with Creative Indie is that real art matters to people. Real art finds an audience and makes an impact. So if you're writing a book for yourself that nobody ever reads, that's not a selfless service you're doing for humanity. That's hubris or vanity or more negative words. It's totally fine. It's a valid form of self-expression if you just want to write a book, because it's a really difficult, challenging project which engages your brain in all new kinds of ways. So it's something you could strive for anyway. But as long as you're going to do that challenge of trying to write a book, I think you also have a responsibility to yourself for creating better art, and also the world at large for creating art that matters, that other people are actually going to read, to investigate the audience and the right, like how do you structure a book. It's something that you can learn pretty easily with research, but a lot of authors just don't. They just have the idea that they're just going to do it their way and the world be damned.
Yeah, and also I would think with some of those groups, there is a hierarchy almost about what genre that you write or what your motives are. Like for me, with my writing, I'm going for entertainment. Like I want someone to be able to escape into my story and just like for a couple of hours forget whatever the hell's going on in their life. So I know that I'm not writing War and Peace. I'm writing something that I hope is just like a fun airplane read or a beach read whenever we can do those things again. But some groups have it where it is more of a higher sort of art and stuff like that. And it's not necessarily because the writing's better, it's just because of the subject matter. At least that's what I found, because I'm one of those plucky science fiction fantasy writers who had the cliche college professor who was like, you can't write this. We need to write literature here.
I think everybody starts off that way. Everybody wants to believe they're, like, I don't think you'd want to be a writer if you didn't think you are good at writing or had been told somewhere along the line that you're better than average at writing. But I think there's the two paths. There's the leaning towards the literary side where you're writing for a smaller audience and it's very hard to please them, and it's very nuanced with the genre. The genre is not as important. So it's a harder target to hit, especially if you're learning how to write. It's much better, I think, I want to say it's better to embrace the commercial side and focus on writing quality books first. Although even if you want to write a literary fiction, there's a way to do that. There are templates and signposts that you could lean into that will help you. With what I think about structure, a lot of artists or authors are really, structure makes them uncomfortable, because the fun of writing is sitting down with a blank page and just expressing yourself, and the joy of discovery when your brain fills in some blanks and you create something you didn't set out to create and you don't know, like, where did this come from? It feels magical and inspirational. That's what a lot of writers love. So to have some kind of a structure feels like it's killing their creativity, which is why they resist against it. But for a lot of writers, they enjoy the process and they create this thing that they enjoyed, but now they have trouble turning it into a commercial product. I have this huge thing about the war of art on my blog, because I get really frustrated with Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, because he says stuff like, don't write for the market, or if you write for the market, then you're a prostitute. But he also that book, The War of Art, was edited by Sean Coyne, and Sean Coyne has a book called The Story Grid, which basically Stephen Pressfield writes from the heart, and he writes all this crap, and Sean Coyne turns it into a marketable commercial book, just like he did with The War of Art, which was just a bunch of loose notes. Sean Coyne, the editor, turned it into a commercial product by figuring out the title and the structure and the organization. And like the whole thing of The War of Art didn't come from the writer, it came from the editor. And then Stephen Pressfield also has a book called Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit, which is really good actually about all the stuff you need to have in fiction. And he says he was a struggling failed writer for 2 decades, resisting structure, but also working in film industry and learning how you need to structure a commercial film for success, before he finally decided to write a commercial book, which was his first book, which was very successful. So I have this like massive blog post because a lot of people start off with The War of Art, and I really think you need to have a clear picture of the whole thing. I don't think it's a smart, like his progression was start with the literary, fail for 2 decades, and then eventually accept the commercial. I think you can reverse that and shave it down to 6 months. You can just quickly start deliberately writing commercial fiction, using all the rules about fiction. And also for nonfiction, I recently, I'm trying to put all this structure together in a book. So I figured out a structure for books that applies to fiction and nonfiction. And it's really just basic things that all books should have. But you can start with that, and it gives you a little bit of a foundation so that you can write a book and know that at least you'll have the basic content in basically the right places. The good writing stuff actually happens in the revision. So once you have the basic stuff in the right places, then it's the editing and the revision. That's when you start to get into choosing better words and having better literary fluency and sentence structure. So that's, if you start off worrying about the sentences and you've completely failed in the structure, you're going to end up with this swamp that you never get out of. And you'll spend years revising it, and nobody else will ever like it because you didn't hit the structure strong enough. And that's what I try to help people avoid, because I don't think you need to fail for years. I think you can start with structure and succeed a little faster.
Yeah, and with a lot of what has come to mind when you were talking is about kind of writers almost thinking of themselves as craftsmen. So there's a progression where if you think about in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, like these apprentice painters would be helping their masters and stuff like that do a lot of art that could be considered genre. Okay, we're going to do a Virgin and Child thing right here. We're going to do a Last Supper. And that's how they practice to explore and then be able to move on to maybe innovate in their own way. It's be a craftsman, learn some stuff, and then you can freelance or explore or do whatever the thing is that you want to do. But what I find interesting is that you're talking about these 2 types of groups and using the war artist, the mindset of that first kind of group, which it sounds like that's the kind to avoid. What is the sort of group that you should maybe be looking for if you are a new writer who wants to find a good community to grow with?
So what I was saying is that a lot of those groups, they just resist the marketing and they just focus on stuff that doesn't really matter. The groups that are good focus on the sales and the marketing because they know their shit. They know that the cover matters, and they're not gonna sugarcoat it. If you have an ugly cover, or if your blurb sucks, or if people don't get what your book is about, they won't necessarily be positive and supportive. It's important to be supportive, and it's important to have that good energy, but it'd be better to get critical feedback from somebody who knows their shit than, hot air blown up your ass by someone who just doesn't, or just wants to make you feel good. It's nice to have both, and it is really important it's important to stay positive. It's difficult to stay positive when you're writing a book and you don't know if anyone's going to like it, or it's a really challenging long-term endeavor. So you do need some of that enthusiasm. There's a book called 20 Books to 50K. My book is Guerrilla Publishing. There's a lot of smaller groups that are just focused on cover design feedback or blurb feedback, where you can get real critical feedback on your stuff. David Gaughran knows his shit. Another name, The Creative Pen. I don't know why I'm blanking on Joanna Penn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's not as much like public Facebook groups as there are communities around bloggers who have been doing this for a while and know what's going on, and they generally share good stuff. And you want those groups, you want to be in groups of people who are successful. And it can be like irritating to see people who just write commercial fiction and make a lot of money and nobody's buying your books. It can be frustrating because you think my books are better quality, but if you can't sell them or communicate the benefits, anyway, you're always making a choice about how much you're going to sell based on how much you lean into the demand that is coming from the marketplace, because that's the one thing you don't have control of. You can control every aspect of your book, but it's all going to come down to how many people actually want to read those kind of books like yours. And that's the most important decision that you have to make, is what kind of books do you want to write for what kind of audience? That's something you have control over. And people say, I could never write that kind of book, or I want to write what makes me happy, but that's really a personal decision that nobody can make for you. It's always going to be a balance. Do I want to write books or mermaid books? Do I want to spend the same amount of time and sell 3 to 10 times more copies because there's a bigger audience for that subject? It's a personal decision. I understand that's something that a lot of people wrestle with, but that is going to have a really big impact down the road. I wanted to say something else. You touched on craftsmen, which I think is a really good example. The difference between artists and artisans, because an artisan was just someone who was really skilled. They practice a lot. They create the easy stuff. Like before you become an artisan, you make tables. You don't learn about the decoration stuff. You learn how to make a functional table with 4 legs and a flat surface. It's got to work first, and then you can make more money if you start embellishing and doing something new or different or creative or interesting. Once you build an audience, once you build a platform of people who know that you can at least provide a basic table experience. I think that's an important metaphor. And a lot of people, like, art was the same for 2,000 years until during the Romantic period, people decided they were tired of going to school for 10 years, tired of competing to become like perfectly skilled craftsmen and working that hard. And they decided art was just all about emotion and feeling, and the skills weren't important, which is why a lot of like writers now, they feel like they can just write a book even with no training or no practice or nothing, and it's just going to be awesome. Except for one interesting disclaimer, that there's no luxury goods market for books, which means you can set an ebook for $2.99 to $6.99. You can set a paperback for around $10. Spending more time honing it or writing it won't even make it better quality. It won't even make it more satisfying to readers necessarily. I think focusing on the market is the easiest way to write a book that actually satisfies readers. It's not the polishing and the embellishing, but also, even if you spend all that extra time, you're not going to get paid for it because you can't charge more for the book. You may be able to sell more copies to a wider audience, but that's really going to be about the market demands, not the... I think quality is a weird word, because if I say not the quality of the book, people will say I just talk about writing shitty books and the quality doesn't matter. It's not that. I just think that when other people talk about quality, they think about sentence structure stuff that readers don't even notice and might actually be annoying. If you're an artist or an author who considers the quality of literature, there's a good chance you're putting too much of yourself in the work, because you're not thinking about how do I make this a clean, exciting experience for readers. You're thinking a little bit too much about, look how clever I am for choosing these clever words, which is not the place you want to be in when you're writing books.
Yeah, especially not in the beginning, because words are most clever when they're assembled with some setup and payoff. And that's the difficult thing, I think, for a lot of writers. We could extend this metaphor even to the marketing part of it, because part of what I think for those who are, what does writing to market, understand the market, what does this mean? A lot of times the simplest way to explain this is that these are the genres. So somebody who's going to the store and they're looking for a thriller like a Jack Reacher or James Patterson or something like that, they know when they pick up a book or they look at it on Amazon, because of the cover or the blurb, they have a good idea. This is going to, be a thrill ride. There's going to be some espionage. There's going to be something cool like that. And a lot of writers, because they're very close to, I think, especially in the beginning, and I'm the same, you're very close to your material, and it's hard to know what is the biggest piece of DNA, because you might have a book that might be mostly a fantasy, but you had some inspiration from, I don't know, Citizen Kane or something like that. So there's a dramatic subplot and you're trying to work that in, but you're really the only one who's going to see that homage. Most people are going to be like, oh, this kind of is Orville or something like that. This is a space opera. So, people have trouble with that. But also on the market is just understanding, for those who are like, I don't understand this term, it's just understanding that you are setting up an expectation for the reader when they open up the book, and you're meeting that. Especially a good example, I think, and Derek, let me know if you have a better one, is for the romance genre. When someone gets a romance novel with a capital R where it has like a Fabio or something on the cover, the thing that they're expecting is that there's a happily ever after. At the end of the book, the romance, it has like a good closure, the couple is together, and they've withstood the odds. So if you have a romance that's capital R, has a Fabio on it, and then Fabio gets run over or something like that, you're gonna have a lot of pissed off readers.
The other way I like to think of it is, like, when someone goes into a bookstore and they're looking for a book, you don't have a lot of time. Like, you're not standing there talking about your book. So you'll never have an opportunity to convince them of why they should be interested in a book like yours. They're just going to buy what they like. They're going to buy the books they already know they like, by authors they already like. So you mentioned earlier, like, using other people's famous authors' names in your blurbs, where you say this book is for readers who like Tom Clancy. And if they like Tom Clancy, then they know that this is a book for them. And if the cover looks pretty similar to the books they like to read, like, all you're doing is you're trying to position your book so that readers know it's the kind of stuff they already like to read. And then it's up to you to fulfill that promise and expectation. Otherwise, they're going to quit reading or they'll leave a negative review. But that's writing to market. That's smart business. You're not trying to educate the consumer about what they should be reading, because it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be a lot of hard work, and most people are going to tune you out because they don't care about what you have to say or what you think they should be reading. They're going to buy the books they like. So that's the choice. It's either, do I need to have a conversation to convince them to read a book that they don't actually want to read with all this data and proof and argumentation, or do I just give them the book that they want to read and make sure I'm writing those kind of books?
Yeah, and I would think that while some new writers, like for me, my first novel, that's never going to see the light of day. I wrote that, I set it down, I read it again, and I was like, nope, I'm going to do a do-over on something else. And so there's definitely writers who, a trunk novel is a good tradition. But for writers who or aspiring writers who are like, this sounds constricting, like, I found that once I was like, you know what, I'm writing an urban fantasy, and I had a good idea of, because I like this book, I like these books. Like, a lot of times I think people forget what they actually normally read, and they're like, I'm gonna write War and Peace, but they really write like they read Danielle Steele. I just leaned into the commercial fiction that I already was reading, that I already enjoyed, and then it made it just easier for me then to figure out, okay, urban fantasy readers like seeing the main character in a leather jacket on the cover. Okay, bam, got it. That's one decision that I don't have to think about. But I do think that there's a lot of joy in being a writer nowadays. So how about you tell me a little bit about where publishing is? Because I think one of the things that's really cool is that, yes, there are still great bookstores and great publishers, but there's also a lot more space for different voices out there. So we've talked about a lot of some of the doom and gloom, some of the reality. Let's talk about the opportunities and the joys right now in publishing and writing.
Okay, that's tricky because I always want to lean on, because publishing is such a weird industry because it's a $1 billion industry, but all the money is going to service providers because most authors are writing books that nobody wants to read, like the vast majority, which means there's all this money and investment going into books that other people aren't willing to pay for. And there's also a ton of readers who are hungry for commercial fiction that are only being that demand is only being met by 100 writers maybe. There's really not that many. And those 100 writers, they have a huge backlist. They spend really big money on ads. So it can be really exciting because some people are definitely making 10 grand a month or 20 grand a month, or even much more. It's possible to make a whole bunch of money with your writing in a way that's never really been true before, but it's also not the Wild West stage. Like 10 years ago, you could take advantage of some new thing that Kindle offers and be the only piece of content on Amazon in that category and suddenly make millions of dollars. That was those early self-publishing case studies of like Amanda Hawking and Hugh Howey. They wrote really good books, but they didn't really have the greatest covers when they first started. They were doing a lot of things wrong, but they showed up and they put their books out and they made a whole bunch of money because Amazon was pulling all of these people into Kindle Unlimited and there just wasn't enough content yet. So these days, there's a whole bunch more competition. It's harder to stand out. And also with advertising, the people who are making the money are usually advertising pretty heavily also. So you may feel like it's too difficult for you with only a couple of books, or you don't write that quickly, or you don't have a huge advertising budget. It can feel frustrating to see what you're up against. For me, the reason I love it so much is that I know that my audience wants to read my books. So that's the advantage of writing to market, is that I've written books that I like to write. I'm really excited about the books that I'm writing. And I also know that when I publish them, my readers will buy them. And it may not be tons of money yet, but once I finish the series and start marketing, I know that I can just make this full time and just be waking up and writing my books and doing what I love, which is a realistic goal if you're doing everything right. And compared to other small businesses or online services or whatever, there's nothing quite as enjoyable about just being able to work on your own creative projects and also know that you're not just wasting your time. I think that's the hardest thing about writing a book is it's a lot of work, but you've got to feel like you're going to be rewarded for all the investment that you put in. Otherwise, why do it? And that's why I think it's a little dangerous to think I don't care about the money, because then there's no metric to measure whether or not you're going to be like, whether or not you're wasting your time, whether or not you have an expensive hobby. So like I could be doing other things with my hundreds and hundreds of hours of time that would be more enjoyable and more rewarding or make more money. So I think that's why a lot of writers quit. If they write a couple books and they think, shit, I've spent thousands of hours doing this one thing and I am not getting paid for it and nobody cares, like I'm not getting any reviews, I don't have any readers. I think it's harder to sustain yourself through the hard times unless you start to build some of that platform stuff or the income stuff up. But the nice thing about writing your own books, as opposed to something like a services business, is that you always have more content, you always have more products. So it's going to get easier and easier over time to not only learn how to write good books, but also learn about the marketing and the sales and the book cover design. A lot of authors I know, I have a group for young adult authors called an Alliance of Young Adult Authors. And a lot of those people, they joined, I think 5 or 6 years ago. They were struggling. They didn't have good covers. Nobody wanted to buy their books. And in that period of time, they go from struggling to successful really quickly, because they finally figured out, like they got all the covers redone. They started writing to market. They started figuring out their blurbs and their advertising. And suddenly they're doing really well and making really good money, because it's a matter of just having all the factors in place and once you get everything to click and your conversion is good and advertising actually works for you, then you can scale really quickly and you can suddenly be making a really good deal of money, which is not just about the money. If you are profitable, it means you can reach more readers, you can get more reviews, your work is having a bigger impact to a broader audience. That's why I think it should be the goal for any creative artist.
Yeah, and the thing is that I know that for some folks, and this was important for me in the beginning, and I don't know about you, but getting into a feedback, or at least finding some sort of feedback and response to your work is helpful. And that's where like maybe writing your trunk novel and posting it on Wattpad or doing fan fiction can come in handy. And then you can move into, okay, I've gotten the writing and the craft stuff where I'm pretty confident. I understand my motivation. I'm enjoying this. I've gotten some good feedback. Now I can transition into thinking about, okay, I'm ready for the market. I've done my homework. And then you're ready to be in the phase where you're waiting for feedback. Because at least for me, like I started trying to build up my sort of author brand, I guess, platform like a couple of months before I first published my book and everything. And I was just giving away short stories and stuff for free, being like, hey, join my email list, check out this story. And I was able to get a lot of good feedback and stuff like that. So for folks who are listening and they're like, oh man, it sounds like you got to work for 5 years in isolation and stuff like that. It take time. Like my first writing group that I started with 7 years ago, and it's taken that long for me to get 3 books out. But during that time, you can get feedback, you can study the market, you can learn some stuff, you can toss some sort of stories out there. And then when you feel like you got the bones right, you got in the book, you got the right marketing, then you can ship that baby out. So I think a lot of folks, they want to skip those steps. They hit the save button, they wrote the end, and now they're like, time to get it out there, as opposed to maybe it might take a little bit longer. I don't know. I know I just rambled there, but
No, I think what you did was really smart, but it's because you already knew what was going on, because you come from a business background. So like you knew that you needed to set these things up before you started. For a lot of authors, they wouldn't know how to do what you know how to do. And so their impulse would be to just wait until they get a publishing deal or contract, or somebody else, gets on board, or I work with a lot of authors who just spend way too much time with all this other bullshit stuff that isn't actually going to matter, isn't actually going to sell books. And they'll waste time on that stuff, when I think sometimes like they have to put the book out and fail really hard before they're even willing to figure out, okay, maybe I have to actually do this stuff because no one's going to do it for me. I don't know. I feel like I want people to build a platform and launch a book like you did it, because that's the smart way to do it. But a lot of authors, they're not ready for it because they're not ready to put in the time and the investment. For one, because they don't know if the book's anyone's gonna like it anyway, or they just think it's gonna be amazing and sell 1 million copies, and they don't need to do anything else, and that readers will just find it. So sometimes they just have to be disillusioned before they can devote more time and resources towards the stuff that they're avoiding.
hmm yeah, you're right, because there's a lot of myths, and we talked about those. I think if there's a thesis statement for this episode, it would be talking about the realities of publishing, self-publishing, and I feel like that's really helpful for folks. I don't know if a lot of the listeners are aware, but there's a lot of ways to lose your money with both traditional and self-publishing. So going into this sort of endeavor with your eyes open, knowing to check websites. I think it's called Writer Beware and other those watchdog groups and stuff. They'll let you know who's legit, who's not. And I think that makes it a lot more of a satisfying experience. In the end, you go into it being like, okay, here's what I'm dealing with, everybody, but you know what? I'm gonna get this next great American novel out anyway.
I think the red flags to watch out for are anyone who sounds excited about your book, and you don't know how, if they reach out to you directly on social media or by email and they say, I loved your book, I really want to help you publish it or something, that's something I would watch out for. Or any guarantees, like guarantee bestseller, guarantee $20,000 a month, whatever, all the stuff that sounds too good to be true. Or if they guarantee results, it's just, I don't know, there's far more, I want to say scams than there are legitimate services, but that's also because there's so much more demand than there is service providers who are meeting the demand. And there's so many more clueless authors who don't actually want to investigate the claims or do any of the work or learn about, if someone tells you, like you and I would say, this is hard and frustrating, it can totally be done, but we're honest about what to expect. That's not sexy for new authors. They just want somebody, I get emails all the time, but I don't want to do anything. How much money can I give you to just take over and do everything for me? And that's unfortunately, that's what some authors, they're resisting the stuff that they have, that they don't want to do. And I don't think there's any service provider who can. There are people who take that money, but I don't think there's anyone who can provide the results, which is why I usually won't take that money, because if I haven't read your book, if I don't know the audience, if I haven't done the cover design or whatever, I'm not going to be responsible for the launch of the marketing, because I know that the product's not going to convert. Or I may be able to do a really good job with what you have, but it's still not going to be successful. And then I'll feel bad about it and you won't be happy, which is the majority of those expensive marketing platforms. They sound good, but they almost always, you'll overpay and you won't be happy with results because they didn't help you actually write a good book or package it the right way or find your audience. Nobody else is going to do that for you. So I don't think there's really the shortcut that everybody wants and is looking for doesn't really exist. You really have to learn some of the basic stuff yourself, even, and it's a pain point. It's in the business world, we say you find the pain point, you sell it. And there's definitely a lot of money to be made from authors because they don't want to do this stuff. So there are people who will offer the moon, and a lot of authors who are willing to pay for it until their book doesn't sell, nobody reads it, and they feel like it's a waste of money. And then there's a good chance they wasted too much time on that one book and it didn't have a market or an audience anyway. And then they'll either, learn from their mistakes and try to do it better, or give up writing, which is something I try to prevent happening.
Yeah, and I definitely have seen people talk about some big numbers that they tossed at some vanity publishers and things like that. And the thing is that I feel like traditional publishing is a very good choice for a lot of people, but the reason why they have those gatekeepers there is just like you said, they're not going to take a bet on a product that they can't open up the hood on and maybe fix up the engine a little bit. And that's why for the big publishers, it can take a year or more to have a book actually go to market because they're doing so much behind the scenes. Yeah, so it's a funny business as well in many ways. I feel like it's a satisfying one. I feel like being a writer for me brings me a lot of joy and everything like that. But I do definitely, when I'm done with that draft or I'm done working on the manuscript, I have to take off the writer hat and then I put on the business hat. And I think once I was able to separate those two entities and not make one side feel bad, or I'm not like conflicted being like, oh, my precious words, why are we saying it's like this or that, or we're putting this price on it? I separate and I'm like, here's what we got to do. And I think that can really help. And I know that for a lot of folks who do want to be writers, I feel like there is a lot of opportunity. It's just a matter of making sure that you understand, like pretty much any other creative profession, you got to build up that audience. You got to earn the know, like, and trust, and then keep delivering. I feel like there is a lot of readers who are out there looking even for random books. What is that genre that's big now? It's the one where it's like Ready Player One, and it's just a whole
Lit
genre
RPG.
where, yes, lit RPG, and it's literally this crazy popular genre of all these people who just wanted to be trapped in a video game. There's a lot of random ideas that can find a market if you package it up right.
Yeah, I was also going to comment on something. I don't know if I'm going to be able to say it, but it seems like the choice is between writing to market or writing to an audience versus writing something literary, something for yourself, something that you think is more enjoyable. But I think the other actual choice, actually making it a good book with strong writing, because if you think, okay, I'm going to write to market, I'm going to write a lit RPG book or a vampire book or whatever, that's still not enough. That's one little piece. But the more interesting thing is, how do you keep people reading your book? How do you make people invested in the story? How do you make them love your characters? And that's mostly about conflict, suspense, and intrigue, which are really like fascinating things. How do you create that space that hooks readers and pulls them forward in your story? And there's different ways to do it, but it's not so much the words that matter. It's just being really clear about, anyway, it's the more advanced writing stuff that I think is usually missing. When I get a lot of books to edit or for feedback, I do a lot of like first chapter critiques, and it doesn't really matter if it's written for market or if it's genre specific. It's just that the book is boring. It just doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't hold my attention. It doesn't pull me forward. I don't care about the readers or the characters, or I don't know what's happening if it's needlessly confusing, or it's just bad writing. There's just like really bad stuff in there. I think this stuff is all really interesting. So it's what I've been focused more on recently, because you can even have a really good book that's a really good story, but it just needs to be fixed and tweaked. And that tweaking stuff, it can be really difficult. It can, when I do developmental editing, it takes longer to revise a book than to just write a first draft. But all, like, I can take as long as bones are good, as long as it's plotted and it has a good structure, I can fix it a lot. But if it doesn't have a good structure at all, you might have to cut out chapters. You may have to add a whole bunch of new chapters. Generally, the most important thing is the motivation, the stakes. Like, why are the characters even doing these things? And why does it matter? Why do they intentionally put themselves in dangerous situations? There's a lot of stuff, like, it can't just be all just stuff happening. There's a lot of stuff you need to do, especially in genre fiction, where it's not actually genre specific. It's just writing a good book, which is why I quaffled on that quality earlier, because when you talk about quality, it just gets really confusing. But good writing a good book, it just, I think if the readers keep reading, then it's good, or it's good enough. And a lot of people, they think they have great writing, but readers quit because it's, the story isn't there. It's just not interesting to read. So I think that's one of the differences, is it's not about the quality of the writing or the structure or your writing to market. It's just, are readers enjoying this? They have a million other things to do. Are they reading your book, or do they quit because there's other more enjoyable things to spend their time doing?
Yeah, and they need to be compelled, I feel. And even there's some books where, and people might laugh, but like my sister was really into Twilight, and Twilight wasn't, I wouldn't say that like I thought it was great, but when I read it, even though the prose is pretty basic, Bella's pretty basic, there was still something in the narrative that was compelling. There was a clear stake, there was clear tension, there was a mystery. So you can really have even like some like literary books that I've read that like can feel overblown. One person who is very wordy is Anne Rice, but she's able to pepper enough conflict and intrigue and suspense that you're willing to wade through the half paragraph about a chair. You're like, oh wow,
A
there's
lot
a
of
lot
it's
of
also just trust in the author. So if Anne Rice, millions of people read her, you might know this is a harder book, but you also trust that it's going to have an emotional payout. You can trust the author when you get to the end, it's going to be worth the effort, even if it was hard in the meantime. Whereas if you're an indie author, readers won't give you that trust. If it's a little bit hard or difficult or confusing, even if the writing is beautiful, if they don't know what's happening, they're going to wonder, should I spend 5 or 6 more hours finishing this book? Is it going to be worth my time? And if you're not famous, if you don't have tons of reviews, it's going to be easier for them to put the book down and quit. Which is why, like, it's not even a choice between commercial fiction and literary fiction, because uh, literary fiction is harder to write, but it's also harder to convince readers to spend their time with you and trust that you know where you're going, that you're taking them to a satisfying resolution.
yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's definitely something that I think with time and more books, and I know we keep saying with time and more books essentially, but that's true. I don't feel like this is a field where it's like a one and done. You even put it on your website in a good way. The creative indie it's about a process, it's about an evolution, and having some freedom and control over your own creative work.
And creativity, I mapped out the kind of manifesto or the 6 or 7 step process or whatever, probably 7 years ago. And I've not yet completed that manifesto or that book, because to some extent, I don't feel like I've gone through the whole process yet, those stages. I've been figuring a lot of stuff out business wise, but that last important step is, once you've got everything right and working, and you have the right content, and you build your audience, then you can scale really quickly, so that you can not only invest more in your platform and your content and your books, but also invest in your community and spending more time or devoting more resources to helping other people who are lower down the path than you are, following your footsteps. So I feel like I'm reaching the end of that long process, and it took me a long time to get there. But yeah, it's not, when you publish, when you want to be a writer, it's not really just something you're going to decide, I'm just going to publish a book and it's going to be amazing and sell a million copies. It's usually a longer process that involves putting out a lot of content, building an audience, communicating with your readers. It can all come together. And once you have the content, I've seen a lot of my friends, and I like to say friends because like when I started writing young adult fiction, I didn't know anybody. And I researched who were the best sellers. I became friends with them on Facebook groups. And over years and years of correspondence, now I feel like I'm at least a little more than on the radar. I feel like people know who I am, but it's because I've been active in a space for a long time providing value. And that's so rewarding and valuable just so that I'm not writing in a vacuum, so that I know that other people, even successful best-selling authors who have sold lots of books, they're also still struggling with the exact same things that I'm struggling with. We're all still changes in the Amazon system, lowered sales because of coronavirus. There are things that come up that affect all of us equally because we're all earning our money from the same space, which is usually Amazon, but it can be other online bookseller platforms as well. So it's nice just to have a group who knows what the struggle is and I can count on to be there for me.
Mm-hmm.
I got off topic, but something like that.
No, I actually like this. It's like in this podcast, we've gone through the full hero's journey in some senses. And I think this is a good time to end the interview because I feel, and this is how I feel like every time we have a conversation, is that I end up thinking that I was asking about one thing and then I learn about all these other things. And I like how you always go back to the past. It always feels like I get an answer and then I get the historical context from which our society inspired such a construct, which I appreciate. And I hope everybody who's listening enjoys it. And for those who have stuck with us through all this, they're jazzed, they're ready, they want to learn, where can they find you on the web? And if you got something new coming out the oven, let us know. Give us all the deets.
I'd look for Creative Indie, the website, but also on YouTube, because I usually put a lot of rough videos out on YouTube, even when I don't blog about them. I've got a bunch of free books about publishing and writing on Amazon or on my website. A lot of them you can get for free if you sign up somewhere. The most important one, I think, will be this Bestseller Blueprint. I'll probably change the title once I've got it figured out, but it's more about like a book on actually writing books. Not so much, I have Book Marketing is Dead, which is a basic, and I have Guerrilla Publishing, which is more advanced marketing stuff. But I really think what most writers need the most help with is actually writing a good book, because that's going to make long-term the biggest difference to success, is whether readers enjoy what you've finished.
Yeah, no, I always look forward to your stuff. I'm subscribed on your YouTube, and I've been enjoying the many changes to your hair. Gentle listeners, take note. Derek's been growing it out, and it looks pretty luxurious now. But yeah, thank you so much, Derek, for being on the show. I really do appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Sure, I love talking about all of this stuff.
Awesome. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening. As always, I'm Sami Gardner, your career specialist. Bye.
Change your career, change your life at CareerKickstartAcademy.com.